We might get started. My name's Luke Glanville. I'm a member of the Department of International Relations here in the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Jessica Wolfendale here to talk to us as part of our department's 75th anniversary public lecture series. I'll perhaps say a little bit about a couple of forthcoming lectures at the end of tonight. Jessica Wolfendale is Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Law at Case Western Reserve University in the United States. Professor Wolfendale is originally from Canberra, and so among her many celebrated achievements, no doubt her most cherished is the fact that she achieved a Bachelor of Arts here at ANU. Among her many publications on topics of security, torture, terrorism, bioethics, military ethics, Professor Wolfendale has authored a number of books, including Torture and the Military Profession, published in 2007, and War Crimes, Causes, Excuses and Blame, written with Matthew Talbot and published in 2019. And I understand she's presently working on the next book, this time looking at torture and terrorism in America. So each of her books then deals with pretty fraught, somber, sobering topics. And tonight Professor Wolfendale will talk to us about yet another fraught, sobering topic. Her lecture tonight is titled Accountability and Moral Reckoning After the Brereton Report. My pleasure to hand things over now to Professor Jessica Wolfendale.
Thank you. Okay, well, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Kean O'Driscoll for inviting me to give this lecture. I'm really honoured to be here, and it's really an honour to see you all in this room. And I couple this having, read the parts of the Brereton report a couple of years ago. I wrote a couple of short pieces for ABC Religion and Ethics. So it's been something that's been in the back of my mind over the last few years. And what I want to do today is really sort of focus a little bit on narratives of responsibility that have emerged after the report, and critique two in particular sort of common ways of thinking about responsibility that I've sort of seen in media, political statements and so forth, before turning to the question of what this means for the victims' perspectives and for the idea of collective responsibility. So I will try and keep an eye on the time and not talk for more than, say, 40 minutes. So brief outline, I'll talk very shortly in a very brief detail about some of the findings of the report, but I'm going to assume that most of you at least know the main outlines of this report. Then I'm going to focus on these two, what I call apologist narratives of moral responsibility. So one is what I call the bad apples narrative, and the other is what I call war is hell, and I'll describe those shortly. Then I'm going to turn to the question about collective responsibility and how that connects to collective identity in an institution like the military, which is really founded on the idea of a shared identity. And finally, I want to turn to something which I do feel has been somewhat neglected in public discussions about the report, which is the victim's perspective. How should we understand the nature of the harm that was inflicted on the victims and their communities? And what does this mean in terms of what the victims are owed going forward in response to this report? Okay, I do want to start by saying too that some senior commanders have taken responsibility and offered apologies. So nothing I'm saying here is intended to suggest that senior command in the military and special forces have not taken this seriously. But really, again, my focus here is on kinds of narratives that have come out, I think, particularly in the media, that, and as going forward, and as there are more perhaps criminal prosecutions of some of the soldiers who were identified in the report, we're likely to see these repeating narratives again. So it's even more important, I think, to kind of examine them and critique them, and if possible, rebut them. Okay. So again, to recap, I won't spend much time on this. The basic findings of the report were that there was credible information that Australian forces had killed 39 Afghan prisoners and civilians, and actually treated 2 detainees, I think the phrase was cruel and unusual punishment, between 2005 and 2016. The report identified a range of different factors that the report claimed contributed to these crimes, including a kind of toxic, corrupted warrior culture among the special forces that were involved in these crimes. they also identified a number of practices that accompanied these crimes. So one was this practice of blooding. So this is a practice where young Special Forces soldiers who are new would be allegedly instructed by a commander to execute a detainee as a kind of initiation rite into the unit. Another practice that was identified in the report was what's known as throwdowns. So throwdowns refers to when weapons or radios are placed on the body of a prisoner or civilian who's been killed in order to help concoct a cover story that will divert scrutiny from the killing by making it look like the person killed was in fact carrying a weapon. So as part of that, we also see manipulation of the rules of engagement, quite intentionally, to cover up these crimes. So according to the report, this is a quote from the report, operation summaries and other reports were routinely embellished, often using boilerplate language, in order proactively to demonstrate apparent compliance with rules of engagement and to minimise the risk of attracting the interest of higher headquarters. So there's a sort of interesting theme that emerges from the reports of how the soldiers involved clearly were very familiar with the rules of engagement and the laws of armed conflict, and in fact use that information to engage in practices of covering up their crimes by making them appear compliant. Another factor that emerged from the report is sort of broader concerns with reporting and oversight mechanisms. So the report said that inside the ADF, reporting and oversight mechanisms failed to detect potential war crimes because commanders were too trusting and too protective of their subordinates. So rumours of war crimes were already circulating as early as, I think, before 2015. And there was a report by Dr. Samantha, and I'm going to mispronounce her last name, and I'm really sorry ahead of time, Crumpvetz, thank you. Crumpvetz, which highlighted a lot of rumours and a lot of reports of potential war crimes, but also highlighted the problem of getting anyone to speak freely because of this pervasive culture of, again, toxic kind of loyalty, protectiveness and secrecy. So the other side of this was that when local nationals did report potential war crimes, and this happened, again, over many years, their complaints were often ignored. So the report does suggest, for example, that sometimes complainants were assumed to be just engaging in Taliban propaganda, right, by reporting possible war crimes, or they were just out for money. They were trying to get compensation. And so this led to this sort of, again, this habitual ignoring and dismissal of complaints and reports from local nationals and communities affected by these crimes. So, again, that's a bit of background for you. I'm sure there are many of you in this room who might know about this in a lot more detail. But moving on now to the question about moral responsibility. So what I think we've seen are two actually competing narratives about the responsibility of the perpetrators that have come out in some media reports, in some public statements, in some official statements. And again, both of these I think are very problematic, and I'm going to explain why. And again, it's really important that I think we start to think about these narratives now, because as, again, criminal prosecutions start to occur, I think the first soldier was charged last year, they're going to become more common. And so we need to be very clear going forward in how to think about and approach questions about discussing responsibility for these crimes. So I'm going to turn now to, where's my clicker? Apologist narrative 1, so bad apples. So the idea of an apologist narrative is a narrative which aims in some way to minimise, deflect attention to, or undermine claims of responsibility for war crimes. Now, the bad apples narrative is interesting because the bad apples narrative doesn't, in fact, try and claim that the war crimes didn't happen. That would be what we might call a denialist narrative. But rather it says that these crimes were the result of just particularly bad people, rather than reflective of any kind of broader issues. So again, there's actually a quote from Chief General Angus Campbell's speech, which actually, again, took responsibility, made apologies for the crimes. But he implies this a little bit when he says that the overwhelming majority of Special Forces soldiers did not choose to take this path. No matter the stress and strain of battle, they remain true to our values and our laws. There's another quote from Dr. Samantha Kromfetz, which makes us sort of gestures towards a similar view. Excuse me. There has been failures of leadership, people whose character is perhaps unethical, before they even got into special forces, and they've taken advantage of opportunities to behave in particular ways. This is a very common narrative when war crimes occur. And what's initially, I think, appealing or intuitively attractive about this narrative is that on the face of it, you might think, well, of course, for someone to intentionally kill innocent people, they have to be a bad person, right? That just seems like an obviously true statement. And it's deeply challenging to realise, as I'll suggest later, that actually that's not the case. That people who view themselves as good, people who are viewed by other people as good, can in fact come to engage in atrocities. But initially, our first base response is to say, yeah, it's something about these particular soldiers that led them to take advantage of the relative freedom from scrutiny in the arena in which they were acting. And so in that sense, we don't have to worry then about whether or not these crimes were the product of broader institutional forces. So the Bad Apples narrative individualises responsibility down to the level of the perpetrators, and really the perpetrators alone. So the problem with this narrative, though, as I've already suggested, is that, well, first and foremost, there's something a bit strange about it. So again, 25 soldiers are discussed in the Brereton report as being either direct perpetrators, sometimes in more than one event, or at least closely associated with these crimes. It seems a little odd that all those 25 soldiers somehow would happen to be the 25 soldiers with the kind of bad character who would engage in these crimes. It's very likely that these 25 soldiers, when they joined the army, when they joined Special Forces, would have been horrified at the suggestion that one day they would be involved in killing innocent civilians. Right, so that's already something which is a little bit sort of hinky, to use an official term, about this. Well, they're just bad people. Just happen to be those 25 bad people, right? It also diverts attention away from factors that the Brereton report itself identified as contributing to the commission of these crimes. So again, we have this toxic warrior culture within the unit itself, but there are also, research that suggests that elements of that warrior culture are present in the broader Australian military. An emphasis on toughness, denigration of softness, valorisation of certain kinds of stoicism, which can easily bleed into a kind of desensitisation. And the very fact that Special Forces soldiers are held up as being the best of the best sends a message about the kinds of traits and values that are viewed as being the most desirable, right, in the military. So you have this sort of broader interconnection between the toxic, corrupt warrior culture identified in Brereton and perhaps elements of broader military culture. The Bad Apples narrative conveniently ignores the role of commanding officers, both, close to the chain of command at the events and higher up the chain of command. And again, there is a lot of evidence in the report that shows that commanding officers sometimes knew about these affairs, it chose to ignore them. Either, again, ignored complaints from victims, complaints that persisted over many, many years, and engaged in active cover-ups in some cases. So if we attribute these crimes only to the Bad Apples who committed who were the direct perpetrators, we can ignore the role and the kind of complicity that enabled these crimes to go unchecked for almost 9 years. If you think about a healthy organisation, of course it's true that sometimes people will do bad things, right? So to that extent, there is an element of truth in the Bad Apples. Yeah, there are sometimes bad people who will take advantage of a lack of supervision or a certain kind of freedom. But that might explain why a crime occurred. It doesn't explain why the crimes were continued to occur over many years. It doesn't explain why the victims were treated with disdain and contempt, not only, obviously by the direct perpetrators, but by the local command. It doesn't explain the kind of widespread toleration of the sort of freedom from rules that permeated certain kinds of Special Forces culture. So we really have to be careful to resist attempts at attributing responsibility that take the form of a bad apples narrative, because they fail to engage in, really some of the more fundamental questions, which is not just why did this one person do this bad act, but why were they allowed to continue doing these bad acts? Right? Why has it taken so long for this Brereton report to even occur? It also, I think, ignores the prior history of war crimes. So the Brereton report does document, there's a section in the report that talks about the history of Australian forces and war crimes, and does mention that there were at least reports of the use of practices like throwdowns in the Vietnam War by special forces. There are other countries where special forces have been involved in similar kinds of crimes, and where the contributing factors were also very similar. So Donna Winslow in 1997 published a report on the Canadian Airborne Regiment. It's not a special forces unit, but it is an elite unit and bears many of the same sort of hallmarks. And she identifies factors in those crimes that are almost identical to those identified in the Brereton report. So, for example, she talks about a belief in exceptionalism. She talks about brutal hazing initiation rites, a kind of aggressive, toxic warrior conception of masculinity, a disdain for softness and toxic loyalty as all contributing factors to the crimes committed by this airborne regiment in Somalia in the 1990s. So this history actually, again, tells us over and over again, this is not just something which just happens to be this one bad person. There's patterns here that we can identify both in Australia and in other countries. So I want to move on now to the second apologist narrative, which is in some ways the opposite of the bad apples narrative in relation to the attitude it invites us to take towards the direct perpetrators. So here's an example of a narrative which I'm calling War is Hell. This is a quote from Martin Hamilton Smith, chair of the Australian SAS Association. Afghanistan was one of the most difficult conflicts imaginable. Our people didn't know who their enemy was. The farmer by day could be Taliban terrorists by night. Our people were faced by terrible, gut-wrenching decisions. And here's a second quote, which also encapsulates this kind of narrative. This is from the full-page ad that John Singleton took out. I want to say The Australian? Was it in The Australian? Okay, of course it was in The Australian. It has many rich quotes to draw from. This is one. We, the great majority, envy your courage. This is, of course, to Ben Robert Smith. We envy your courage, strength, commitment, and the torture you must now endure. In that awful moment, the soldier has to react. Someone has to pull the trigger, kill or be killed. So what both of these quotes have in common is that they are asking us to feel sympathy for the perpetrators. To view the perpetrators, again, this is the opposite in some ways of the bad apples narrative, not as intrinsically bad or unethical people, but as good people, in a sense, forced into doing bad things because of the unendurable pressures of the situation in which they acted. Pressures that kind of overtook, in a sense, their good character. So it's an excusing or exculpating narrative. It's a narrative that says, hey, we shouldn't blame the perpetrators, or at least we shouldn't blame them as much as we would perhaps if they committed those crimes in different circumstances. Really, it's war that's at fault here, not the individual actors. War has made these people do these terrible things. And I think another part of this narrative is, and sometimes it's explicit, it's those of us who have not fought in war, those of us who are not there are not in a position to judge, right? So this is, I think, really clearly expressed in John Singleton's view. We don't know what it's like to have to, face death on the battlefield, to be surrounded by people who might be your enemy, to see your friends be killed. So who are we to judge, right? Our position should be one of, in a sense, awe that you are fighting for us at all, and certainly not a position of moral judgment on what you did. So the war is hell narrative, as I said, is a kind of polar opposite of the bad apples, right? It's saying, hey, these people are not bad people, they're good people. We can't understand what they've been through. What they've been through is what made them do what they did. It's a situation, it's not them. It also very clearly invites us to identify with the perpetrator, to almost imagine what it would be like to be in their shoes. And what that means is that when we take this position, when we identify with the perpetrator, we are avoiding or not identifying or not really thinking about the perspective of the victims, which is something which I'm going to come to shortly. But here's why we should be, want to debunk the war is hell narrative. It's very, very clear from the Brereton report that none of the alleged killings, the report says this explicitly, none of the alleged killings or the treatment of the detainees occurred in the heat of battle. These are not situations where a soldier cracks under stress and fear, kills an enemy prisoner of war. Right? These are situations where these are killings committed in, cool, calm deliberation. Deliberate, intentional. The other thing the report says is that none of these killings that were alleged to have occurred in circumstances where the perpetrator's intention was unclear, confused, or mistaken. I.e., the perpetrators knew exactly what they were doing, and they did what they wanted to do. Right? So one thing that the war and hell narrative asks us to imagine is that, in some sense, the perpetrator's actions don't reflect their values. They're kind of being forced to do these bad things because of the situation they're in, or they're acting under extreme pressure, which implies, in a sense, that we should blame them less because, in a sense, they were acting out of character. Right? They weren't really doing what they wanted to do. But that's just obviously not true. The facts of the case clearly show that the perpetrators were doing exactly what they wanted to do. Their intentions were perfectly clear. All people interviewed for the report clearly understood the laws of armed conflict and the rules of engagement. There was no confusion here about whether someone was, in fact, a lawful target. Additionally, the practices of blooding and throwdowns, again, these are not fog of war practices. These are intentional, planned practices. First of all, designed to initiate new Special Forces soldiers into the practice of killing, and then to cover up killings, to manipulate language, manipulate knowledge of the rules of war, to hide what they did. All of these actions speak of, again, direct intention. So to adopt the war is hell narrative is not just, in a sense, factually mistaken in terms of the circumstances under which these crimes were committed and the intentions behind the actions, but it really does ask us to prioritise the perpetrators in this case and to pretend, as it were, that the perpetrators' actions were not, in fact, reflective of their intentions, and that's simply false. And I think the way to also understand what the perpetrators' actions meant, what they communicated, is when we really have to turn to the victim's point of view. So I have here a quote from an Afghan journalist called Bilal Sawari, who interviewed some of the community members who were affected by these crimes. And this is what he says. These are Afghans. He talks first about how they come from very destitute, very poor communities. And then he says, these are Afghans who got killed at the hands of soldiers who they had put their trust in. They thought this was a mission that was bringing security to remote villages, valleys, and districts. And I think this is really, the reference to trust here I think is really important to understanding the scope and scale and depth of the harm that was inflicted, not just on the direct victims, but on the communities to which they belonged. So certainly we can understand how these crimes caused direct harm. They were killings. They caused immediate harm to the victims. They harmed the families of victims, caused grief and distress. But they did a lot more than that, right? So I think another aspect of the harm that was inflicted is in the way that local nationals who tried to report these crimes, to protest them over years, were consistently treated as liars or as the enemy, right? And that kind of treatment communicates to those people that their protests are not going to be believed. They're not going to be treated as moral equals. The harm that's been inflicted in their communities is going to be disregarded. And they're going to be treated as enemies. And to me, that is a kind of moral injury that's been inflicted on the victims in their communities. So moral injury is often a term that's used to describe feelings of guilt and shame experienced by soldiers. But I actually think here we have an example of a different kind of moral injury, where not just the direct victims and their families, but the whole community are denied moral standing, are denied the ability to protest, denied the ability to hold someone to account for the really egregious wrong that has been inflicted upon them. And that denial of the ability to hold someone to account, the denial of moral standing that's inflicted on them by the way they were treated when they tried to protest, when they tried to make reports, is really key to this idea of loss of trust. They would have had no reason not just to trust that they would be safe, but to trust that they would even be treated in a morally, basically decent way, right? So there's a real attack on moral trust that comes from the way that these crimes were regarded when local nationals tried to report them. So that's why I think of this as an infliction of moral injury. So what I'm suggesting here is that the harm to the victims, when we think about what is it that is owed to the victims, and that's what I'll talk about at the end of the paper, we have to understand that against understanding the depth of the harm that was inflicted, right? And understanding that it goes well beyond the loss of the lives of the victims and the harm to the grief to their families, to this infliction of an ongoing form of moral injury, which again lasted for many, many years and contributed to these crimes going unchecked. So what does this mean though for the idea of collective responsibility? Well, I have to check my notes. Because this kind of moral injury, in a sense, compounds the harm of the original crimes, it does suggest, or it reveals really, that responsibility extends again beyond the direct perpetrators to the local command structure that chose to ignore, cover up, or actively try and hide the existence of these crimes. But what does it mean in terms of responsibility? So we're talking about moral responsibility. Well, one of the impacts I think this has, and again, this is also understanding how the victim's perspective can help us understand the nature of the harm that was inflicted. It's obviously true the perpetrators acted individually. I'm certainly not claiming here that all special soldiers forces bear the same degree of blameworthiness or responsibility for these crimes. Of course, that is not the case. The perpetrators were not acting in the name of special forces, and Chief General Angus Campbell is absolutely right to say the vast majority of Special Forces soldiers did not engage in this behaviour. But while the perpetrators acted individually, they share a collective identity. And the idea of collective identity is really important to military cultures across the globe, right? It's part of wearing the uniform, being part of this identity, being part of what it's supposed to represent to the world and to the individual who's part of it, whether it's values, behaviours, ethics, a warrior identity, something like that. And a lot of military training and culture is really about trying to internalise that collective identity, to generate that sense of shared pride and shared identity. So if you think about what this means in terms of the uniform, so, hopefully one would think that when one sees an Australian Army uniform or a Special Forces uniform, that uniform is associated with morally laudable traits and behaviours, protection, safety perhaps. And if you go back to the quote from here, they thought it was a mission to bring security. So initially when they see these uniforms, they think, oh, okay, now we're going to be safe. But what those uniforms came to represent to the victims and their communities is not safety and protection. It's not honour, loyalty, any of the kind of values that the Australian military claims to uphold, but fear and unchecked violence, right? So the meaning of that collective identity to the victims was drastically changed through not just the commission of the crimes, but again, the cover-ups, the failure to take the protest seriously. Right. This uniform now is about arbitrary violence that will not be met with any kind of punishment that could be inflicted on you, your neighbour, your family, your friends, and nobody would be held accountable. That's what the uniform now means to those people, those communities. So what this means then is that if you share this uniform and you share this collective identity, when you, members of your group have engaged in atrocities, again, while in this uniform, while representing this identity, in a sense, that is also something that you share. And this makes sense if you think about how we think about collective honour. So you take the meritorious unit citations, and there was again a controversy early on after the report when Peter Dutton overturned General Angus Campbell's decision to revoke the meritorious unit citation that had been given to, or was going to be given to 3,000 Special Forces soldiers for their service in Afghanistan. Now, Dutton said something along the lines that it's wrong to punish the 99% for what the 1% did, right? So that we have a bit of a bad apples reference right there. But I think what's mistaken about Dutton's approach is that if you think about what a meritorious unit citation is, so these 3,000 soldiers had this citation, it clearly is not meant to say that every individual soldier of that 3,000 acted exactly the same kind of way, engaged in exactly the same kind of bravery. The citation represents a collective risk that was taken by the group, collective actions that were taken. So if there can be collective honour shared by the group, then there can be collective shame, right? You can't have one without the other. So when a collective identity has become a source of terror for people, then collective shame is the appropriate response. Now that does not mean, and again I'm not claiming here that therefore all Special Forces soldiers ought to be blamed for what happened, because that is not what I mean. But it means that there is an importance, there needs to be an awareness that the uniform now has this meaning, and that the communities who have been affected by these crimes might see you, and maybe you had nothing to do with them, but they'll see your uniform and they'll associate that with fear and terror. And so in a sense you now have a duty to respond to that fear, to do what you can to try and mitigate the fear that is now associated with your collective identity. So that's what I mean when I talk about the idea of collective shame. So what does this mean though in terms of going forward? So I know that there is still ongoing, I think, efforts to revise and reform ethics education in the military as a response to, actually these were actually already occurring before the Brereton report, I believe. There were already, I think, moves to address aspects of Special Forces culture before the report came out. I was not able to find out a lot of detail about specifically what's happened, and maybe there are people in the room who know more than I was able to find out. I think the Defence website has some information, but again, doesn't go into a lot of detail. So this is very promising. It's really good, and it's heartening to see that the Australian military has taken this very seriously and is engaging in steps to try and change aspects of its culture that might have contributed to this. But I also think part of this should be not just say increasing ethics education or changing perhaps the nature of ethics education, but actually acknowledging and addressing through training education that good guys, people who view themselves as good soldiers, as good men and women, can and have committed atrocities. So even within the way these crimes are talked about, perhaps in informal settings or informal education settings, there has to be the acknowledgement that, yeah, this is not a rejection of the bad apples idea. This is not just because these people were somehow unethical characters who slipped through the net, right? These are people, again, who started off, as I said earlier, probably would have been horrified when they first joined at the mere suggestion they could end up committing such crimes. So there really has to be, I think, a direct acknowledgement of that possibility in training and education. I think it's also true that promoting empathy is just not enough. So sometimes that's raised as well, if they'd had more empathy for their victims, maybe they would not have done this. Perhaps that's true, but empathy is extremely, volatile is not the right word I'm looking for. It's a limited resource, right? It's a resource that's deeply unreliable as a way of motivating good behaviour. Immanuel Kant actually knew this. I'm not necessarily a Kantian, but he was very clear that if you rely on something like sympathy to motivate you to do the right thing, When you're tired or stressed or just distracted, what's going to motivate you then? Sympathy, empathy are very tenuous resources that we have. So we need to have ways of motivating and thinking about moral behaviour that don't rely on something as really as vague, but also is subject to bias as empathy. Who we feel empathy for, who we think deserves our sympathy, is deeply shaped by the culture in which we live. And of course, it is not properly coincidental that the victims of these crimes were black and brown people at a time when there were rising incidents of Islamophobia in Australia, right? So again, empathy is a very unreliable tool to try and prevent these kinds of crimes. I think accountability is crucial, and I think this is also why when we think about the way these crimes are talked about and spoken about, again, informally, formally, in the media, in political speeches and official speeches, it's absolutely crucial to avoid the kinds of apologist narratives I've been identifying, right? To genuinely take responsibility at all levels, and I know there's been a lot of debate about command responsibility that I believe is ongoing. Again, I couldn't find out a lot of details about that. I think it's still an ongoing process. But yeah, look at the way complicity operated. Look at the way attitudes of disdain and contempt for victims enable these crimes to go forward. Acknowledge the connection between toxic warriorism and military culture. This is something which I think is actually happening. So this is something I think which is quite promising. But look at the ways in which, say, ordinary hazing practices, initiation rites, tolerated behaviour in informal settings, in military units. What kind of traits and behaviours does that encourage? What kind of loyalty is encouraged and cultivated at the unit level? Is it the kind of toxic loyalty which leads to cover-ups? Is it a culture of secrecy? And finally, I think, I just spoke there about the importance of rejecting apologist narratives, but finally I think it's crucial to actually name and honour the victims. So I really wasn't able to find out the names of some of the victims here. I know in Ben Roberts-Smith's trial, I believe one of the victims was actually talked about at the end. But think about who they are, and I think in training education this is important too. As much as possible, read interviews with the victims, understand what it did to the community, really understand the perspective of the people who have been harmed, rather than adopt, as is perhaps the initial response, the perspective of the perpetrators. The victims, in a sense, can tell us what they suffered, can really tell us, help us understand the scale of the harm that was inflicted. And that can help us understand what needs to be done to try and redress that harm. How do you repair moral trust? How do you repair moral injury inflicted by years of denial, right? That's something which I think is crucial to explore going forward. Okay, I will leave it at that, and I look forward to hearing your questions.